It's a scorching day in the year 202 before Christ. The African sun beats down mercilessly on a dusty plain called Zama, located in what we know today as Tunisia. Two armies face each other across this barren landscape. But this isn't just any ordinary clash of swords and shields. This is the moment that will determine who rules the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. On one side stands Rome, the rising power that has already conquered most of Italy. Their legions, disciplined and determined, represent everything the Roman Republic stands for: order, duty, and an unshakable belief in their destiny to rule. Leading them is a young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, barely 30 years old, yet already earning whispers of being Rome's answer to their greatest nightmare. And who is that nightmare? Well, across the battlefield stands perhaps the most feared military mind the world has ever known, Hannibal Barca of Carthage. This is the same man who, 17 years earlier, had done the impossible. He crossed the treacherous Alps with elephants, defeated Roman army after Roman army, and came so close to Rome's gates that mothers would whisper his name to frighten their children into obedience. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal had been the boogeyman that haunted Roman dreams. But here's where our story gets truly fascinating. How does a young Roman general who has never faced Hannibal in direct combat prepare to take on a commander who has never lost a major battle? What kind of pressure must Scipio have felt, knowing that the entire future of Rome rested on his shoulders? And what about Hannibal himself? After years of brilliant victories, what brought him back to Africa for this final confrontation? You see, the Battle of Zama wasn't just about military tactics or territorial control. It was about something much deeper. The clash between two completely different visions of what the ancient world should become. Carthage represented the old way of doing things, a maritime empire built on trade networks and mercenary armies. Rome embodied something new, a land-based power that sought to impose its laws and customs on everyone it conquered. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The winner of this single day's fighting would become the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The loser would face not just military defeat, but the complete destruction of their way of life. And here's the incredible part. Both generals knew it. They understood that they weren't just fighting for territory or treasure, but for the very survival of their civilizations. What makes this battle even more remarkable is that it almost didn't happen. Hannibal had spent so many years in Italy that many people thought he would never return to defend his homeland. Scipio, meanwhile, had taken enormous risks just to get his army to Africa. Both men had to overcome enormous political opposition in their own governments just to reach this moment. So, as these two legendary figures studied each other across the battlefield at Zama, each was carrying the weight of history on his shoulders. One of them would emerge as the victor and change the course of human civilization. The other would face exile, defeat, and the knowledge that his people's golden age was over. But which would be which? How did a battle between two of history's greatest military minds actually unfold? And why do military strategists still study this confrontation more than 2,000 years later? Today, we're going to unravel the epic story of the Battle of Zama, a turning point that truly reshaped the ancient world. We'll discover how Scipio managed to outthink the unthinkable, why Hannibal's greatest strengths became his weaknesses, and how a single day's fighting in the African desert created ripple effects that we still feel today. So settle in, because this is more than just a war story. This is the tale of how the Roman Empire was truly born, how one of history's greatest generals met his match, and how the fate of the Western world was decided in the dust and blood of an ancient battlefield. Stay with us until the end to discover the shocking twists and brilliant strategies that made Zama one of history's most consequential battles. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more jaw-dropping tales from the ancient world that continue to shape our lives today. To understand just how incredible Scipio's victory at Zama truly was, we need to step back and grasp the sheer terror that Hannibal had inflicted on Rome for over 15 years. Imagine living in a city where every morning you wake up wondering if today might be the day your greatest enemy finally arrives at your gates. That was life in Rome during what we call the Second Punic War. Let me paint you a picture of just how devastating Hannibal's Italian campaign had been. When he first crossed the Alps in 218 before Christ, most Romans probably laughed at the audacity. Who brings elephants over mountains? But Hannibal wasn't just being dramatic. He was making a statement that would echo through history. Nothing, not even the most impossible terrain, would stop him from bringing war to Rome's doorstep. And boy, did he deliver on that promise. His first major victory came at the Trebia River, where he used the brutal Italian winter as a weapon. Picture this. Roman soldiers, freezing and exhausted, trying to cross an icy river while Hannibal's troops, who had actually prepared for the cold, picked them off like sitting ducks. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare combined with tactical brilliance. But that was just the beginning. The following year at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal pulled off what might be the most successful ambush in military history. He hid his entire army in the hills surrounding the lake and waited for the Romans to march right into his trap. When the morning mist lifted, it revealed not an empty battlefield, but thousands of Carthaginian warriors surrounding the Romans on all sides. In just 3 hours, 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead, and their commander was among them. The survivors stumbled back to Rome with tales that seemed too horrible to believe. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Any other general might have been satisfied with these victories and tried to negotiate peace. But Hannibal wasn't any other general. He was playing a much longer game. He understood that Rome's real strength wasn't just its armies, but its network of Italian allies. So instead of attacking Rome directly, he spent years methodically trying to turn these allies against their Roman masters. And then came Cannae. Oh, what a disaster Cannae was for Rome. The year was 216 before Christ, and the Romans had finally had enough. They assembled the largest army in their history up to that point, 80,000 men strong, and marched out to crush Hannibal once and for all. The Roman Senate was so confident that they appointed not one but 2 consuls to lead the army, figuring that surely 2 heads would be better than 1. They couldn't have been more wrong. Hannibal took one look at this massive Roman force and saw not an unstoppable juggernaut, but an opportunity to pull off the most audacious tactical maneuver ever attempted. He deliberately weakened his center line, allowing the Romans to push forward, thinking they were winning. But this was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Romans pushed deeper into his lines, his stronger wings closed in on both sides like a closing fist. What happened next was nothing short of a massacre. The Romans found themselves completely surrounded, pressed so tightly together that they couldn't even raise their weapons properly. In a single day, Rome lost not just 80,000 soldiers, but dozens of senators, hundreds of knights, and 2 consuls. It was the worst military defeat in Roman history, and for many Romans, it felt like the end of the world. Can you imagine the panic in Rome when news of Cannae arrived? Mothers collapsed in the streets, merchants began hoarding food, and some senators quietly started making plans to flee the city. There's a famous story that after Cannae, the Romans were so desperate that they actually practiced human sacrifice, something they hadn't done in centuries, hoping to appease the gods and somehow turn their fortunes around. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Rome didn't surrender. Despite losing more soldiers in a single battle than most countries had in their entire armies, despite facing economic ruin and the very real possibility that their allies would abandon them, the Roman Senate made a decision that would define their civilization forever. They declared that no Roman citizen would even speak the word peace until Hannibal was defeated. This decision transformed the entire nature of the war. Rome began employing what we might call guerrilla tactics today. Instead of meeting Hannibal in large battles, they started harassing his supply lines, picking off his stragglers, and making it impossible for him to rest or resupply properly. They appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator, a man whose strategy was so frustrating that his own soldiers nicknamed him the Delayer. But slowly, painfully, this strategy began to work. Meanwhile, the economic strain was crushing Rome. Imagine trying to fund a war when your enemy controls most of your territory and has cut off your major trade routes. Roman families were selling their jewelry to fund the war effort. Wealthy citizens were building ships with their own money and donating them to the navy. The entire society was mobilizing in a way that had never been seen before, but perhaps the most fascinating part of this entire story is how one young Roman was watching all of this unfold and learning from it. Publius Cornelius Scipio was just a teenager when Hannibal crossed the Alps, but he was paying attention to everything. His father was one of Rome's leading generals, and young Scipio had a front-row seat to Rome's military disasters. What set Scipio apart from other Roman commanders was his willingness to learn from the enemy. While other Romans dismissed Hannibal's tactics as foreign trickery, Scipio studied them obsessively. He understood that Rome couldn't beat Hannibal by doing the same things they'd always done. They needed to think like Hannibal, to be as flexible and creative as he was. Scipio's big break came in Spain, which the Romans called Iberia. While everyone else was focused on defending Italy, Scipio convinced the Senate to let him open a second front. His reasoning was brilliant. Carthage's Spanish territories were the source of much of their wealth and many of their best soldiers. If he could conquer Spain, he could cut off Hannibal's resources and force Carthage to fight a war on two fronts. And conquer Spain he did, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of the grinding sieges and brutal frontal assaults that characterized most Roman warfare, Scipio employed speed, deception, and psychological warfare. He studied local customs, made alliances with Spanish tribes, and showed a flexibility that amazed both his enemies and his own soldiers. The crowning moment came when Scipio captured New Carthage, the capital of Carthaginian Spain, in a single day. He had noticed that the city was protected by a large lagoon on one side, which the defenders thought made that approach impossible. But Scipio had also noticed that the lagoon became much shallower at certain times of day due to tidal changes. So while the Carthaginians were focused on defending the obvious approaches, Scipio sent a small force wading through the shallow water to attack from the supposedly impossible direction. But perhaps even more impressive than his tactical innovations was how Scipio treated his prisoners and the local population. Unlike most Roman commanders, who saw conquered peoples as sources of slaves and plunder, Scipio understood that winning hearts and minds was just as important as winning battles. He returned Spanish hostages to their families without ransom, respected local customs, and treated former enemies with honor once they surrendered. Word of these successes spread throughout the Roman world, and people began calling Scipio the Roman Hannibal. But this wasn't an insult. It was the highest compliment they could give. Finally, Rome had found a general who could match Hannibal's tactical brilliance, his psychological insight, and his ability to inspire loyalty in his troops. By the time Scipio had finished his Spanish campaign, he had accomplished something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. He had given Rome hope. For the first time since Hannibal had crossed the Alps, Romans began to believe that they could not just survive this war but actually win it. But Scipio's greatest challenge still lay ahead. Conquering Spain was one thing, but now he was proposing something that made even his supporters nervous. He wanted to invade Africa itself, to carry the war directly to Carthage's homeland. It was an audacious plan that would require everything he had learned about warfare, diplomacy, and leadership. And the most remarkable part? His plan was specifically designed to force Hannibal to leave Italy and come back to defend Carthage. After 15 years of being terrorized by Rome's greatest enemy, Scipio was proposing to turn the tables completely. Instead of cowering behind walls and hoping Hannibal would eventually give up, Rome would force him to fight on their terms, in a place of their choosing. It was a gamble that would either save Rome or destroy it forever. And at the center of it all was a young general who had learned to think like his enemy, but fight like a Roman. Now, here's where our story takes a turn that reads more like a political thriller than a military campaign. By 204 before Christ, Scipio had accomplished the impossible in Spain, but his next move was so audacious that it left even his supporters speechless. He marched into the Roman Senate and proposed something that no Roman general had ever seriously considered: invading Africa itself. Picture the scene in that marble chamber. Here's Scipio, not yet 30 years old, standing before some of the most powerful men in the Mediterranean world, telling them that Rome's best chance of survival was to attack Carthage in their own backyard. The silence must have been deafening. For decades, Rome had been playing defense, desperately trying to keep Hannibal from destroying their homeland. And now this young upstart was suggesting they should go on the offensive in the most dangerous way possible. The opposition was fierce. Fabius Maximus, the old general who had saved Rome through his delaying tactics, stood up and essentially called Scipio insane. His argument was logical. Why abandon the strategy that had kept Rome alive for so long? Why risk everything on such a desperate gamble? But Scipio had an answer that cut right to the heart of Roman pride. He pointed out that as long as Hannibal remained in Italy, Rome would never be truly safe. They weren't just fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for the right to sleep peacefully in their own beds. What really swayed the Senate, though, was Scipio's strategic brilliance. He explained that an invasion of Africa would force Carthage to make an impossible choice: either leave Hannibal isolated in Italy without reinforcements, or recall their greatest general to defend the homeland. Either way, Rome would finally regain the initiative after 15 years of desperate defense. But here's the fascinating part about Roman politics. Even when the Senate agreed to Scipio's plan, they did everything they could to sabotage it. They gave him permission to invade Africa, but they refused to give him any of Rome's veteran legions. Instead, they told him he could recruit volunteers and take the survivors of Rome's worst military disaster, the legions that had been exiled to Sicily after their defeat at Cannae years earlier. Now, most generals would have seen this as an insult, a way for the Senate to set them up for failure. But Scipio saw opportunity. Those disgraced legions in Sicily weren't just eager to redeem themselves, they were hungry for it. They had been living with shame for years, and Scipio offered them something priceless: a chance to restore their honor. When he arrived in Sicily to take command, these supposedly broken soldiers greeted him like a savior. But recruiting an army was only the beginning of Scipio's challenges. Invading Africa wasn't like crossing a river or marching through familiar territory. It meant taking Roman legions across hundreds of miles of open sea to land on a hostile shore, with no guarantee of supplies, reinforcements, or even a way home if things went wrong. It was the kind of operation that could end a career or a life very quickly. Scipio's solution was typically brilliant. Instead of trying to transport everything his army would need, he decided to make Africa provide for his forces. But this required something that most Roman generals had never bothered with: diplomacy. He needed local allies, people who understood the terrain, the politics, and the resources of North Africa better than any Roman ever could. This is where one of history's most consequential friendships began. Scipio had heard rumors about a young Numidian prince named Massinissa, who had grown tired of being Carthage's puppet. The Numidians were the finest horsemen in the ancient world, the kind of cavalry that could turn the tide of any battle. But they had been forced to fight for Carthage for generations, watching their homeland be treated as little more than a source of horses and riders for Carthaginian armies. Now, convincing Massinissa to switch sides wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just about military alliance. It was about asking a man to betray everything he had been raised to believe. Carthage had been Numidia's overlord for centuries. Massinissa's own father had fought alongside Carthaginian generals. But Scipio understood something that most Romans missed. People don't just fight for money or fear. They fight for respect and the promise of a better future. The negotiations between Scipio and Massinissa were conducted in secret, often through intermediaries who risked their lives just to carry messages between the two camps. Imagine the pressure on both men. If word of these talks reached the wrong ears, Massinissa would face execution as a traitor, and Scipio would lose his best chance of success before his invasion even began. But Scipio had learned something crucial from his years studying Hannibal. The most powerful weapon in warfare isn't the sword or the spear. It's the ability to make your enemies doubt themselves while inspiring absolute loyalty in your friends. His offer to Massinissa wasn't just about military alliance. It was about respect, independence, and the chance to shape North Africa's future as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. The moment when Massinissa finally agreed to join Scipio's cause was one of those turning points that historians love to write about. Here was a Numidian prince, raised to hate Romans, choosing to trust his future to a young Roman general he had never met in person. And here was Scipio, betting the success of his entire campaign on the loyalty of a man who had every reason to betray him. Meanwhile, back in Carthage, the political situation was becoming a complete mess. The Carthaginian government had always been more like a collection of wealthy merchants than a unified military command, and the stress of fighting a 15-year war was tearing them apart. Some senators wanted to negotiate peace with Rome, others insisted on fighting to the bitter end, and still others were more concerned with protecting their personal fortunes than saving their country. This internal chaos became Scipio's greatest advantage. While he was carefully planning every detail of his invasion, building alliances and preparing his forces, Carthage was paralyzed by indecision. They knew the Romans were coming, but they couldn't agree on how to respond. Should they reinforce their African territories? Should they send more troops to support Hannibal in Italy? Should they try to negotiate? The tragedy for Carthage was that they actually had some brilliant military minds available, but their political system prevented them from acting decisively. There's a heartbreaking irony here. The same merchant culture that had made Carthage wealthy and powerful for centuries was now preventing them from responding effectively to an existential threat. When Scipio finally launched his invasion in 204 before Christ, the contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side, you had a unified Roman force led by a general who had spent months preparing for every possible scenario. On the other side, you had a Carthaginian defense that was improvised, under-resourced, and commanded by generals who weren't sure if their own government supported them. The initial landings were almost anticlimactic. Scipio had expected fierce resistance on the beaches, but instead he found confusion and hesitation. The Carthaginian forces that did show up to fight seemed more interested in avoiding defeat than achieving victory. It was as if the psychological damage of years of political infighting had infected the entire military establishment. But the real masterstroke came when news of Scipio's successful landing reached Italy. Suddenly, Hannibal found himself in an impossible position. For 15 years, he had been the aggressor, the one forcing Rome to react to his moves. Now, for the first time, he was the one who had to make a desperate choice. The Carthaginian government sent frantic messages to Hannibal. "Come home immediately," they said. "Scipio is threatening the capital itself." But Hannibal knew that leaving Italy would mean abandoning everything he had fought for. All those victories, all those years of careful campaigning, all the Italian allies he had won over, would be lost the moment he sailed away. Here's what makes this moment so psychologically fascinating. Hannibal was being forced to play Scipio's game now. Instead of dictating the terms of the conflict, he was reacting to Roman moves. The student had become the master, and the master was finding out how uncomfortable it felt to be outmaneuvered. The journey back to Africa must have been one of the most bitter experiences of Hannibal's life. He was leaving behind the country where he had achieved his greatest triumphs, the land where he had proven himself to be one of history's greatest military minds. And he was doing it not because he chose to, but because a Roman general half his age had forced his hand. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that Hannibal's return to Africa was exactly what Scipio had been planning for all along. Every move in this elaborate chess game had been designed to create this exact scenario. Hannibal recalled from Italy, forced to fight on unfamiliar ground, with an army hastily assembled from whatever troops Carthage could scrape together. When Hannibal's ships finally appeared on the African horizon, both generals knew that the stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. All the political maneuvering, all the diplomatic chess moves, all the strategic gambles had led to this moment. Two of history's greatest military minds were finally going to face each other in direct combat, with the fate of the Western world hanging in the balance. But Scipio had one more advantage that wouldn't become clear until the battle itself. While Hannibal had been fighting the same kind of war for 15 years, Scipio had been learning, adapting, and preparing for this exact moment. The road to Zama hadn't just been about getting two armies to the same battlefield. It had been about ensuring that when they met, one general would be ready for anything, while the other would be fighting the last war instead of the current one. The morning of the battle, as both armies formed up across the dusty plains of Zama, you could feel the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. This wasn't just another clash between Rome and Carthage. This was the moment when two completely different approaches to warfare would finally be put to the ultimate test. Let's start by looking at what each general brought to this deadly chess match, because the contrast couldn't have been more striking. Hannibal's army was like a collection of the ancient world's greatest hits, a multinational force that represented the diversity of Carthage's far-flung empire. At the front of his battle line stood 80 war elephants, massive beasts that had struck terror into Roman hearts for decades. These weren't just animals, they were living siege engines, each one capable of trampling dozens of soldiers and breaking the morale of an entire legion. Behind the elephants came Hannibal's first line of infantry, and here's where things get really interesting from a military perspective. These weren't Carthaginian citizens fighting for their homeland. They were mercenaries, professional soldiers from across the Mediterranean who fought for pay rather than patriotism. There were fierce Gallic warriors with their long swords and wild battle cries, Spanish infantry famous for their short, deadly swords, and various other tribal fighters who had signed on for what they hoped would be one final, profitable campaign. But here's the genius of Hannibal's deployment. He knew these mercenaries couldn't be trusted to fight to the death, so he placed them as expendable shock troops. Their job wasn't to win the battle, it was to absorb the initial Roman assault and wear down Scipio's legions before the real fighting began. Behind this first line of mercenaries stood Hannibal's second line, and this is where his tactical brilliance really showed. These were Carthaginian and African troops, men fighting for their homeland with the kind of desperation that only comes when you know defeat means the end of everything you've ever known. They were better equipped than the mercenaries, more disciplined, and crucially, they were fighting for something bigger than money. And then, at the very back, Hannibal positioned his trump card, the veterans of his Italian campaigns. These were the soldiers who had crossed the Alps with him, who had fought at Cannae and Trasimene, who had spent 15 years proving that Roman legions could be beaten. They were older now, grayer, but they were also the most experienced and deadly infantry force in the ancient world. Hannibal was keeping them in reserve for the decisive moment when their experience and skill could tip the balance. Now contrast this with what Scipio brought to the battlefield. His army looked almost boring by comparison, at least on the surface. No exotic mercenaries, no war elephants, no colorful tribal warriors, just Roman legions and their Latin allies, row after row of disciplined soldiers in standardized equipment, standing in the same formations their grandfathers had used. But that apparent simplicity was deceptive. What Scipio had created was something entirely new in Roman warfare, a flexible, adaptive fighting force that could respond to any tactical situation. The key was his modification of the traditional manipular system, the way Roman legions were organized into smaller, more maneuverable units. Traditionally, Roman manipules were arranged in a checkerboard pattern, with gaps between each unit that allowed for flexibility in combat. But Scipio had taken this concept and refined it specifically to deal with Hannibal's greatest weapon, those war elephants. Instead of the usual tight formation, he arranged his troops in columns with wide lanes between them, creating what essentially amounted to elephant highways running straight through his battle line. Think about the psychological impact of this decision. For decades, Roman soldiers had been terrified of war elephants. These massive beasts had trampled Roman armies from Spain to Sicily. But now Scipio was telling his men that they were going to let the elephants charge right through their ranks, trusting in their discipline and training to make this incredibly dangerous maneuver work. The genius of this tactic becomes clear when you understand elephant psychology. These animals, despite their size and power, are actually quite timid and easily spooked. When they charge toward what looks like a solid wall of shields and spears, they'll usually follow the path of least resistance. By creating clear lanes through his formation, Scipio was essentially giving the elephants a choice: crash into walls of Roman steel, or run harmlessly between the columns where Roman archers and javelin throwers would be waiting to harass them from the sides. But Scipio's innovations went far beyond just dealing with elephants. He had also positioned his cavalry in a completely different way than traditional Roman tactics dictated. Instead of keeping them on the flanks as a defensive screen, he had placed them wide on both sides of the battlefield, ready to sweep around and attack the Carthaginian rear once the infantry battle was joined. And here's where Massinissa and his Numidian horsemen became absolutely crucial. These weren't just any cavalry. They were the finest light horse in the ancient world, men who had grown up on horseback and could shoot arrows or throw javelins with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Scipio had spent months training with these warriors, learning their techniques and figuring out how to integrate their fluid, flexible style with Roman discipline and order. As the two armies faced each other across the battlefield that morning, both commanders knew they were looking at a tactical puzzle unlike anything they had faced before. Hannibal was seeing a Roman army that didn't behave like any Roman army he had ever fought. Scipio was facing the accumulated wisdom of 15 years of successful warfare against Rome. The tension must have been unbearable. Imagine standing in those ranks, knowing that in a few minutes you would be fighting for your life against some of the most experienced warriors in the ancient world. Roman soldiers were muttering prayers to Mars, their god of war. Carthaginian troops were checking their weapons one final time. The war elephants were growing restless, sensing the approaching violence. And then Hannibal gave the signal, and 80 war elephants began their thunderous charge across the dusty plain. The ground literally shook under their massive feet, and the trumpets of both armies began to sound, signaling the beginning of what would become one of the most analyzed battles in military history. But here's where Scipio's preparation paid off in the most dramatic way possible. As the elephants approached, instead of panicking or bunching together as Roman troops had done in previous battles, his soldiers calmly opened the lanes they had practiced so many times. The elephants, following their natural instincts, charged straight down these corridors, while Roman soldiers on either side pelted them with javelins and arrows. Some elephants did crash into the Roman lines, and the carnage was terrible where they hit, but the majority were channeled harmlessly through the formation, emerging confused and wounded behind the Roman battle line, where they caused more problems for their own side than for the enemy. It was a masterpiece of tactical innovation, turning Hannibal's greatest weapon into a liability. But the elephant charge was just the opening act. As the great beasts were being dealt with, Hannibal's first line of mercenaries was already advancing, screaming their war cries and brandishing their weapons. This is where the real test of Scipio's tactical genius would begin, because now it was Roman discipline against barbarian fury, order against chaos. The clash when these forces met was deafening. The sound of thousands of weapons striking shields and armor, the screams of wounded men, the shouted orders of centurions trying to maintain formation in the chaos of close combat. For a while, it looked like the battle might go either way. The mercenaries fought with the desperation of men who knew they had no home to return to if they lost, while the Romans fought with the disciplined efficiency that had built an empire. But this is where Hannibal's tactical brilliance really began to show. Just as it looked like his mercenaries might break under Roman pressure, he ordered them to conduct a fighting withdrawal, pulling back toward his second line in what appeared to be a retreat. Many Roman commanders would have ordered an immediate pursuit, sensing victory within their grasp. But Scipio had studied Hannibal too well to fall for such an obvious trap. He recognized this as a classic Hannibalic maneuver, designed to draw the Romans into a vulnerable position where they could be counterattacked. Instead of pursuing, he ordered his troops to maintain formation and prepare for the next phase of the battle. This is the moment when the true genius of both commanders became apparent. Hannibal was trying to recreate the conditions that had given him victory at Cannae, drawing the Romans forward where they could be surrounded and destroyed. Scipio, meanwhile, was refusing to play Hannibal's game, maintaining the tactical flexibility that would allow him to respond to whatever the Carthaginian master might try next. As the mercenaries fell back and merged with Hannibal's second line, the battle entered a new phase. Now it was Carthaginian citizens and African allies against Roman legionaries, men fighting for their homeland against soldiers fighting for the glory of their empire. The intensity of the combat increased dramatically, because both sides knew that this was where the battle would likely be decided. But Hannibal still had one more card to play, and it was his best one. In the rear of his formation, those grizzled veterans of the Italian campaigns were waiting for their moment. These were the men who had helped him achieve every one of his great victories, soldiers who knew every trick of Roman warfare because they had been fighting Romans longer than some of their enemies had been alive. When Hannibal finally committed these veterans to the battle, it was like watching a master craftsman at work. They advanced not in a wild charge, but with the measured pace of professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to maximize their impact on the Roman battle line. This was Hannibal's last stand, his final attempt to work the kind of tactical magic that had made him legendary. He was betting everything on the superior skill and experience of these veterans, hoping that they could break through Scipio's lines and turn the tide of battle just as they had done so many times before in Italy. For a few terrifying minutes, it looked like it might work. The veterans crashed into the Roman front line with devastating effect, their years of experience showing in every sword stroke and shield bash. Roman centurions began to shout warnings as their formations started to bend under the pressure. But this is where all of Scipio's innovations and preparations finally came together. His flexible formation allowed him to reinforce threatened points without weakening his overall battle line. His disciplined troops maintained their composure even under the most intense pressure. And most importantly, his cavalry was finally ready to make their decisive move. Was Hannibal's defeat at this point inevitable? That's a question that has fascinated military historians for over 2,000 years. Comment below with your theories about whether the great Carthaginian general could have found a way to victory, or if Scipio's tactical innovations had made Roman success unavoidable. And make sure to subscribe to Imperium Chronicles as we dive deeper into history's most fascinating military mysteries and tactical innovations that change the course of human civilization. Because what happened next at Zama would determine not just the outcome of this single battle, but the entire future of the Western world. The moment that changed everything came not with a thunderous crash or dramatic charge, but with something far more subtle and devastating: the sound of hoofbeats approaching from behind Hannibal's lines. While everyone's attention was focused on the brutal infantry battle raging in the center of the field, Massinissa and his Numidian cavalry had been executing the most perfect flanking maneuver in ancient military history. Picture the scene from Hannibal's perspective. For the past hour, he had been watching his carefully laid plans unfold exactly as he had hoped. His veterans were grinding forward against the Roman lines, their experience and skill beginning to tell. Roman centurions were shouting increasingly desperate orders as their formations started to buckle under the pressure. For a brief, shining moment, it must have seemed like the old magic was still there, like he could still work the kind of tactical miracles that had made him legendary. And then he heard it, the distinctive war cries of Numidian horsemen, but coming from the wrong direction entirely. These weren't his Numidian allies charging into the Roman flanks. These were enemy cavalry smashing into the rear of his own army. Now, to understand just how devastating this moment was, you need to know something about ancient warfare that Hollywood never gets right. Battles weren't usually decided by heroic duels or dramatic charges. They were won and lost by something much more psychological. The moment when one side realized they were trapped and began to panic. And nothing created panic faster than the sound of enemy cavalry attacking from behind. Massinissa's maneuver was a masterpiece of timing and execution. While Hannibal's attention had been focused on the infantry battle, Scipio's Numidian allies had swept wide around the Carthaginian flanks, moving so quickly and quietly that they were able to get completely behind the enemy army before anyone noticed. It was like a boxer landing a knockout punch while his opponent was focused on defending against a jab. But here's what makes this moment even more remarkable. Massinissa wasn't just following Scipio's orders, he was taking initiative based on his own understanding of the tactical situation. This was the kind of battlefield partnership that could only develop between commanders who trusted each other completely. Scipio had given Massinissa the freedom to act independently, and the Numidian prince had repaid that trust with tactical brilliance. The psychological impact on Hannibal's army was immediate and catastrophic. Suddenly, soldiers who had been focused on fighting the Romans in front of them were hearing screams and the clash of weapons from behind. The natural human instinct is to turn and look when you hear danger approaching from an unexpected direction. And when thousands of men do that simultaneously in the middle of a battle, formation discipline collapses instantly. What happened next was like watching a carefully constructed building collapse in slow motion. Hannibal's rear lines, which had been providing support and encouragement to the men fighting in front, suddenly found themselves under direct attack. The Numidian cavalry wasn't just harassing them with arrows and javelins, they were charging directly into formations that had never been designed to fight in multiple directions at once. But the real genius of this attack wasn't just its tactical surprise, it was its timing. Massinissa had waited until Hannibal's veterans were fully committed to their assault on the Roman center before striking. This meant that Hannibal's best troops, the men who might have been able to rally the army and restore order, were too heavily engaged to disengage and deal with the crisis developing behind them. Meanwhile, in the center of the battlefield, Scipio was watching this unfold with the cold calculation of a master tactician. He could see the confusion spreading through Hannibal's ranks, could observe the way formations were starting to lose their cohesion as men began glancing nervously over their shoulders. And at exactly the right moment, he gave the order that would seal Hannibal's fate. Instead of continuing to absorb the Carthaginian assault, Scipio's legions suddenly went on the offensive. But this wasn't a wild, uncontrolled charge. This was Roman discipline at its absolute finest. A coordinated advance by thousands of men who moved as one, their shields locked together, their swords working with mechanical precision. The contrast with earlier Roman defeats couldn't have been more stark. At Cannae, Roman soldiers had been packed so tightly together that they couldn't even use their weapons properly. At Zama, Scipio's flexible formations allowed every man to fight effectively while maintaining perfect coordination with his comrades. It was like comparing a mob to a machine. Hannibal's veterans, caught between the advancing Romans in front and the Numidian cavalry behind, found themselves in the kind of tactical nightmare that no amount of experience could overcome. These were men who had survived 15 years of warfare, who had fought in more battles than most soldiers could imagine, but they had never faced anything like this. The moment when Hannibal's line finally broke wasn't marked by a single dramatic event, but by 1,000 small collapses happening simultaneously. Here, a century of veterans would break formation and begin falling back. There, a group of African spearmen would throw down their weapons and run. Everywhere, the careful organization that had made Hannibal's army so effective was dissolving into chaos. But even in defeat, Hannibal's tactical genius showed itself one final time. Realizing that his army was collapsing and that the battle was lost, he didn't waste precious minutes trying to rally men who were already broken. Instead, he immediately began organizing a fighting withdrawal, trying to save as many of his soldiers as possible from the catastrophe that was unfolding. This is where we need to separate historical fact from dramatic fiction, because the story of Hannibal's escape from Zama has been told and retold so many times that myth and reality have become thoroughly mixed together. Some accounts have him fleeing the battlefield on horseback, alone and defeated. Others describe him leading a desperate rearguard action while his army collapsed around him. The reality, as far as we can reconstruct it from the ancient sources, is both more complex and more impressive than either of these dramatic versions. Hannibal didn't simply run away from Zama, nor did he fight to the last man in some kind of glorious last stand. Instead, he did what any competent general would do in an impossible situation. He accepted defeat and tried to minimize the damage. The fighting withdrawal that Hannibal organized in the final stages of the battle was actually a remarkable display of leadership under pressure. Even as his army was disintegrating around him, he managed to keep a core of loyal troops together, using them to cover the retreat of as many survivors as possible. It wasn't glorious, but it was effective, and it probably saved thousands of lives. But here's the part of the story that really reveals Hannibal's character. Even as he was organizing this retreat, even as he was watching everything he had worked for crumble into dust, he was already thinking about the future. He knew that this defeat meant the end of Carthage's hopes of matching Rome, but he also understood that his own survival might be crucial for negotiating the best possible peace terms for his people. The pursuit after the battle was led by Massinissa's cavalry, and it was here that the true scale of Carthage's defeat became apparent. Thousands of Hannibal's soldiers were cut down as they fled, their formations completely broken, their morale shattered. The Numidian horsemen, fighting now for their own independence rather than as Carthaginian subjects, showed no mercy to their former masters. Scipio, however, showed remarkable restraint in victory. While he allowed the pursuit to continue long enough to ensure that Hannibal's army could never be reformed, he also gave orders that prisoners should be taken alive when possible and that the wounded should be treated with respect. It was a display of magnanimity that would become one of the defining characteristics of his later career. When the sun set on the battlefield at Zama, the ancient world had changed forever. Rome's victory wasn't just military, it was psychological and political. For the first time in living memory, Hannibal Barca, the undefeated genius of Carthage, had been comprehensively outmaneuvered and defeated. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded him since he crossed the Alps was gone, shattered by a Roman general who had learned to think like his enemy while fighting like a Roman. But what happened to Hannibal after this devastating defeat tells us as much about the man as all his victories combined. Instead of accepting exile or suicide, as many defeated generals might have done, he returned to Carthage and threw himself into the work of rebuilding his shattered homeland. He became a politician, a reformer, working to strengthen Carthage's institutions and prepare for a future that everyone knew would be dominated by Rome. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who had spent 15 years trying to destroy Rome now spent his remaining years trying to save Carthage from Rome's inevitable revenge. He instituted economic reforms, rebuilt the city's defenses, and even served as chief magistrate using the same strategic brilliance that had made him a great general to try to make his city a survivor rather than a conqueror. But Rome's victory at Zama had made one thing absolutely clear. There was no longer room in the Mediterranean for two great powers. Hannibal's very survival, his continued presence in Carthage, was seen by many Romans as a threat that could not be tolerated. The man who had once been their greatest nightmare was now their most dangerous reminder that empires, no matter how powerful, could still be vulnerable to the right combination of genius and determination. The final chapter of Hannibal's story would play out years later, in exile, far from the battlefields where he had earned his fame. But the impact of what happened at Zama that day would echo through history, changing not just the balance of power in the ancient world, but the very nature of warfare itself. Scipio had proven that tactical innovation and flexible thinking could overcome even the most experienced and brilliant opponent. And perhaps most importantly, Zama had shown that Rome's greatest strength wasn't just its legions or its resources, but its ability to learn from defeat and adapt to new challenges. The republic that had nearly been destroyed by Hannibal's genius had not only survived, but had produced a general capable of outthinking one of history's greatest military minds. The age of Carthage was ending, and the age of Rome was truly beginning. The dust had barely settled on the battlefield of Zama when the true cost of Hannibal's defeat became crystal clear. This wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of Carthage's slow, agonizing death. Picture this. Carthaginian envoys, once proud representatives of a maritime superpower, now standing before Roman senators like children being scolded by their parents. The peace terms Rome demanded weren't just harsh. They were designed to ensure Carthage would never again pose a threat to Roman supremacy. First came the financial devastation. Rome demanded 10,000 talents of silver. And here's where it gets interesting. To put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to 300 tons of pure silver. Carthage would have to pay this astronomical sum over 50 years. Imagine trying to rebuild your entire civilization while simultaneously bleeding money to your greatest enemy for half a century. But the Romans weren't finished. They demanded something even more precious than silver: Carthage's children. The city had to hand over 100 hostages, chosen from their noble families. These weren't just prisoners. They were living insurance policies, guarantees that Carthage wouldn't dare break their word. Picture the heartbreak of Carthaginian mothers watching their sons and daughters march away to Rome, knowing they might never see them again. The naval restrictions were perhaps the cruelest cut of all. Carthage, the great maritime power that had once controlled the Mediterranean, was reduced to owning just 10 warships. 10. For a civilization that had ruled the seas, this was like clipping the wings of an eagle. They could no longer protect their own trade routes or defend their remaining territories. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Scipio was living every general's dream. The Senate granted him something rarely given to living men, a triumph that would be remembered for generations. Picture the scene: Scipio riding through the streets of Rome in a golden chariot, painted red like Jupiter himself, while hundreds of thousands of Romans cheered his name. It was during this celebration that he earned his legendary title, Scipio Africanus, Scipio, the conqueror of Africa. He was barely 35 years old and had just defeated the greatest military mind of his generation. For a moment, he stood at the pinnacle of Roman society, untouchable and beloved. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Success in Rome was a double-edged sword, and Scipio was about to learn this lesson the hard way. His very greatness became his downfall. Other senators began to whisper, "Who does he think he is? A king?" In the Roman Republic, no single man was supposed to shine too brightly. The political knives came out slowly at first. Accusations of corruption, questions about his campaign finances, suggestions that he'd grown too fond of Greek luxury during his time in the East. By the end of his life, the hero of Zama was living in voluntary exile, bitter and forgotten. It's one of history's great ironies. The man who saved Rome from Hannibal was ultimately destroyed by the very system he'd fought to preserve. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Zama's aftermath was what it revealed about Roman character. Victory didn't satisfy Rome. It only whetted their appetite for more. The crippled Carthage that emerged from the Second Punic War should have been enough to ensure Roman security for generations. Instead, it became a source of paranoia. Here's where we meet one of history's most obsessive figures, Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder. This man made it his personal mission to destroy Carthage completely. Every single speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic, ended with the same 7 words: Carthage must be destroyed. Whether they were discussing tax policy, road construction, or judicial reforms, Cato would somehow work in his favorite phrase. The Romans began looking for excuses, and they found them. When Carthage finally tried to defend itself against attacks from Roman-allied Numidian tribes, the very same Numidians who had helped Scipio win at Zama, Rome declared this a violation of their peace treaty. It was like a bully claiming self-defense after his victim finally fought back. What followed was the Third Punic War, and it was less a war than a prolonged execution. In 146 before Christ, exactly 56 years after Zama, Roman legions broke through Carthage's walls after a 3-year siege. What they did next shocked even hardened ancient warriors. They didn't just conquer Carthage, they erased it. Every building was demolished, every citizen killed or enslaved. The Romans even salted the earth so nothing would grow there again. It was genocide on an unprecedented scale, and it all traced back to the humiliation Hannibal had inflicted on Rome decades earlier. The great irony is that Hannibal, in crossing the Alps and winning at Cannae, had sealed not just his own fate, but the fate of his entire civilization. By making Rome feel truly threatened for the first time, he'd awakened something that would eventually consume not just Carthage, but much of the known world. Zama didn't just end the Second Punic War. It marked the moment when Rome stopped being a regional power defending itself and became an imperial machine that would devour everything in its path. The boy who had sworn eternal hatred of Rome at his father's altar had, in the end, created the very monster that would destroy everything he held dear. You know what's absolutely mind-blowing? A battle fought over 2,000 years ago on the dusty plains of North Africa is still being studied in military academies around the world today. The echoes of Zama didn't fade with the ancient world. They've been reverberating through history, influencing some of the greatest military minds who ever lived. Picture this. It's 1807, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered half of Europe, is sitting in his tent, candlelight flickering across maps and ancient texts. What's he reading? Accounts of the Battle of Zama. Napoleon was absolutely obsessed with Scipio's tactical innovations, particularly how the young Roman had turned his enemy's strengths into weaknesses. Napoleon once said that Scipio was the only ancient general who truly understood the art of combining different types of forces. At the Battle of Austerlitz, when Napoleon deliberately weakened his center to lure the Austrians and Russians into a trap, he was channeling pure Scipio. The French emperor had studied how Scipio created those gaps in his lines to let Hannibal's elephants charge through harmlessly, then closed the trap behind them. But here's the fascinating part. Napoleon's downfall came when he forgot Scipio's most important lesson: know when you've won enough. Scipio defeated Hannibal and secured Rome's dominance, then largely stepped back from politics. Napoleon, he kept pushing until the whole world united against him, just like Rome had done with Carthage. General George Patton, that legendary World War II tank commander, kept a well-worn copy of ancient military histories in his personal library, and Zama was one of his favorite case studies. Patton saw in Scipio's use of Numidian cavalry the same principles he applied with his armored divisions: speed, flexibility, and striking where the enemy least expected it. Even modern special forces training incorporates lessons from Zama. The idea of creating controlled chaos, of making your formations flexible enough to adapt in real time, that's pure Scipio. Navy SEALs and Army Rangers study how he turned Hannibal's elephants from weapons into liabilities, learning how to use an enemy's assumptions against them. But here's what most history books gloss over: the staggering human cost of this glorious victory. While Scipio and Hannibal are remembered as legends, thousands of ordinary people paid the ultimate price for their ambitions. Think about this. Hannibal's army at Zama included mercenaries from across the Mediterranean, Gauls who'd left their families in modern-day France, Spaniards seeking fortune, Numidians following their tribal leaders. When the day ended, most of them lay dead on that African plain, their names forgotten by history. They'd become pawns in a game played by empires. The civilians suffered even more. Carthaginian farmers watched their fields become battlegrounds. African villages were looted to supply both armies. Women and children became refugees, fleeing the advancing legions with nothing but what they could carry. Victory parades in Rome celebrated the glory, but nobody counted the innocent lives destroyed in its pursuit. Here's a detail that'll break your heart. After Zama, thousands of Carthaginian prisoners were sold into slavery. Imagine being a free citizen one day, then finding yourself chained in a Roman marketplace the next, your entire world reduced to someone else's property. The glory of ancient warfare always came at this terrible human cost. The saddest part? Most of these wars didn't even need to happen. The Second Punic War started because two expanding empires couldn't figure out how to share the Mediterranean. Pride, ambition, and the inability to compromise turned what could have been a diplomatic solution into decades of bloodshed. Now let's talk about the most fascinating rivalry in ancient history, not just as enemies on a battlefield, but as two completely different models of leadership that still resonate today. Hannibal was the ultimate charismatic leader. Picture this guy. He crossed the Alps with elephants when everyone said it was impossible. He kept a multinational army loyal to him for 16 years, while they were stranded in enemy territory. His soldiers would follow him anywhere because he shared their hardships. He ate the same food, slept on the ground with them, fought in the front line. But here's Hannibal's fatal flaw. He was so personally charismatic that his entire strategy depended on him being there. When he finally faced Scipio at Zama, his army was tired. His political support at home had crumbled, and he was essentially fighting alone. Charismatic leadership is powerful, but it's also fragile. Scipio represented something entirely different: systematic, institutional leadership. He didn't just rely on personal magnetism, he built systems that could work without him. When Scipio adapted Roman tactics to counter elephants, he didn't just train a few elite units. He restructured the entire manipular system so any Roman legion could handle the threat. Here's what's brilliant about Scipio. He studied his enemy so thoroughly that he essentially became a better version of Hannibal. He combined Roman discipline with Carthaginian flexibility. He understood that true victory meant not just winning battles, but creating conditions where future victories were inevitable. The contrast shows up in how they handled their troops. Hannibal inspired through personal example, brave, brilliant, but irreplaceable. Scipio created systems that elevated everyone's performance. Roman soldiers at Zama fought better than they ever had before, not because they loved Scipio more than Hannibal's men loved him, but because Scipio had given them better tools and training. This rivalry teaches us something profound about leadership that's just as relevant today. Do you build everything around your personal charisma, making yourself indispensable but also creating a single point of failure? Or do you create systems and institutions that can succeed even when you're not there? The tragedy is that both men were, in their own ways, victims of their success. Hannibal's genius made Carthage dependent on him, and when he finally lost, the entire civilization collapsed. Scipio's systematic approach made him so effective that Rome's politicians saw him as a threat to their power. In the end, Zama teaches us that the greatest victories often carry the seeds of future defeats, and that the most brilliant leaders are those who understand not just how to win, but how to build something that lasts beyond their own lifetime. The echoes of that ancient battle are still teaching us lessons about power, ambition, and the true cost of greatness. And so, as the dust settled on the plains of Zama in 202 before Christ, history itself had been rewritten. The mighty Hannibal, the man who had haunted Roman nightmares for 16 long years, finally met his match. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. The Battle of Zama wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of something far greater and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Think about it for a moment. Rome's victory at Zama didn't just end the Second Punic War. It launched the Roman Empire on a path that would see it dominate the known world for the next 6 centuries. From the hills of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germany to the deserts of Arabia, Roman eagles would fly, all because of what happened on that dusty battlefield in North Africa. But there's a darker side to this victory that often gets overlooked. Carthage's fate at Zama served as a chilling warning to every empire that would follow. The message was crystal clear. Challenge Rome, and you don't just lose a battle, you lose everything. Just 54 years later, in 146 before Christ, Rome would return to finish what Zama started. They would burn Carthage to the ground, salt its fields, and sell its people into slavery. An entire civilization erased from existence. Here's something that gives me chills every time I think about it. Legend says that Scipio himself wept when he watched Carthage burn decades later. The young general who had so brilliantly outmaneuvered Hannibal had lived long enough to see his victory lead to something he never intended: the complete annihilation of a people. You see, history isn't just a collection of dates and battles. It's a tapestry woven from the choices that define entire civilizations. At Zama, Scipio chose to adapt rather than repeat Rome's old mistakes. He chose flexibility over rigidity, innovation over tradition. Hannibal, for his part, chose to fight on foreign soil with exhausted troops rather than retreat to fight another day. These weren't just tactical decisions, they were civilization-defining moments. And what about the human cost? While we celebrate Scipio's tactical genius and marvel at Hannibal's legendary reputation, it's worth remembering that thousands of young men died on that field. Roman legionnaires who had trained since boyhood, Carthaginian veterans who had followed Hannibal across the Alps and through Italy, Numidian cavalry who fought for gold and glory, all of them became footnotes in history's grand narrative. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Zama is how it reveals the cyclical nature of power. Rome's victory made it drunk with success, convinced of its own invincibility. Sound familiar? Every great empire in history has fallen into this same trap, the belief that military might makes you untouchable. Rome would learn this lesson the hard way, centuries later, when its own enemies would use Rome's tactics against it. So what can we learn from these echoes of the past? That adaptability beats tradition every time. That victory without wisdom leads to destruction. That the choices we make in moments of triumph often matter more than the triumph itself. Scipio understood his enemy better than his enemy understood himself. A lesson that applies whether you're commanding legions or leading a modern corporation. The ghosts of Zama still whisper to us today. They remind us that every ending is a beginning, every victory carries the seeds of future defeat, and every choice we make ripples through generations. The question isn't whether history repeats itself, it's whether we're wise enough to listen to its warnings. If this epic saga of ancient rivalry, tactical genius, and civilizational consequences has gripped you as much as it grips me, then smash that like button right now. Share this with your fellow history buffs who love diving deep into the stories that shaped our world. And subscribe to Imperium Chronicles because, trust me, we're just getting started. The past isn't dead and buried in dusty textbooks. It's alive, breathing, and speaking to us across the centuries. Every week, we uncover these incredible human stories that remind us who we are and where we came from. Hit that notification bell because next week we're diving into how Rome kept its promise and literally erased Carthage from the map. It's a story of revenge, politics, and the terrifying power of imperial ambition. The past is alive, and together we're going to uncover every thrilling, heartbreaking, and mind-blowing moment of it. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, you're not just watching history, you're living it.